For over 20 years, I trusted the man I loved. My husband, Dorian Hale, kissed me goodnight, told me I was his world. He made me believe I was the anchor in his life, the reason he smiled every morning. But behind closed doors, he was carefully weaving lies, whispering stories that painted me as fragile, unstable, and unworthy of respect. At first, I thought it was just misunderstandings, but those whispers grew louder, and eventually, the image he created of me spread far beyond our home. I had no idea those lies would catch fire, turning into gossip that went viral. Friends turned cold, neighbors looked at me differently, and I felt my dignity slipping away piece by piece. But here's the twist. Karma doesn't forget. The very lies he built to destroy me became the rope that unraveled his own image. When the truth surfaced, it didn't just trickle, it exploded. Dorian's carefully polished reputation shattered in front of everyone who once admired him, and the world saw him for what he truly was. Stay with me, because the way karma unfolded in this story will leave you stunned. And before we dive deeper, make sure to like this video, hit the hype button, and subscribe, because the truth deserves to be heard, and your support ensures more untold stories find their voice. My name is Selene Hale. I met Dorian when I was 23 years old. He walked into my life like a storm I didn't see coming, charming, magnetic, the kind of man who could disarm a crowded room with nothing more than his smile. He had a way of making people feel like they were the only one who mattered when he spoke to them. It was intoxicating, and for someone like me, quiet, reserved, more comfortable in the shadows than the spotlight, he seemed like the piece I didn't know I was missing. Where he was bold and flamboyant, I was steady and grounded. Where he thrived on attention, I thrived on building stability. At first, I thought our differences balanced us perfectly. What I didn't realize was that my steadiness was something he would later exploit to fuel his own image. In those early years, I believed in him with every fiber of my being. I was raised to value loyalty and the power of hard work, so I gave myself fully to building a future with him. While he was out dazzling friends, colleagues, and strangers with his charisma, I was behind the scenes making sacrifices to keep our lives afloat. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when hours were short, scraping together enough to pay bills, manage rent, and ensure we could hold on to the vision he painted for our future. He wanted the finer things, the shiny exterior that kept people admiring him, and I convinced myself that my sacrifices were part of love. That's what devotion meant to me, carrying the weight so he could shine. But devotion can become a trap when it's one-sided. Looking back, I see how I ignored the red flags. There were moments when his stories didn't quite line up, when he exaggerated his achievements or accepted praise for things I had quietly taken care of. Still, I swallowed my doubts, telling myself I was being too critical, too suspicious. I thought being a good wife meant standing silently behind him, letting him play the hero, while I kept the foundation stable beneath his feet. The truth is, I poured myself into Dorian's dreams without ever questioning if he would do the same for me. I skipped vacations, delayed finishing my degree, turned down better job opportunities, all to make sure he had the freedom to cultivate his golden boy image. He would step into a room dressed in confidence, while I would step out of the back door exhausted, invisible, but satisfied that I was helping him succeed. My quiet strength became the backdrop for his public charm, and the world only saw one side of the story. And yet, as much as it drained me, I told myself I was doing it for us, for the family we would one day build, for the stability we both claimed to want. I believed love meant sacrifice, and I gave without keeping score. But the dangerous thing about sacrifice is that when it's not reciprocated, it becomes exploitation. Dorian learned that I would always bend, always give, always cover for him. That trust, that loyalty, that relentless effort to hold our world together became the very things he twisted into weapons later on. My journey with Dorian wasn't just about falling in love with the wrong person. It was about how easy it is to lose yourself when you confuse loyalty with silence. And that's why I'm telling this story. Because so many of us, especially women who give more than we take, need to be reminded that love without respect isn't love at all. its performance, and eventually the curtain falls. At family gatherings in the Hale mansion, the roles were always the same, as if each of us had been cast in a play that never changed. Dorian shined in the spotlight, all charm and easy laughter, the kind of man who could tell the most ordinary story and make everyone around the table lean in with rapt attention. His older sister, Evangeline, was his fiercest protector, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and always ready to jump to his defense even when no one had questioned him. To her, I was the outsider who had taken a place at her brother's side, and she never let me forget it. If I made a comment, she would arch a brow, as if to remind everyone that she doubted my worthiness to sit among them. Her words were polite enough, but her tone always carried a sting, subtle but undeniable. And then there was Helena, our neighbor, who floated into gatherings with her bright scarves and sharper whispers. She adored Dorian's charisma, often laughing just a little too loudly at his jokes, but her admiration carried a double edge. For every compliment she offered, there was a morsel of gossip she tucked away to feed the wider circle. I learned quickly that what was said in Helena's presence rarely stayed private. She relished being the courier of half-truths, and I often felt her eyes on me, studying, waiting for a misstep she could spin into another tale to tell. Meanwhile, Marcus, my childhood friend, was the quiet counterbalance. He would come to these gatherings not as family, but as someone who had known me long before Dorian's shadow stretched across my life. Marcus was steady, dependable, the kind of man who never needed attention to prove his worth. More than once, he defended me when whispers turned cruel, his voice calm but firm. Yet in the noise of Dorian's performances, his loyalty was often drowned out. People brushed him aside, dismissing his words as if he simply didn't understand the brilliance of Dorian Hale. And sometimes, if I'm honest, even I ignored his warnings. I told myself Marcus was being overly cautious, that he couldn't see what I saw in Dorian. Looking back, I realized he was the only one trying to keep me tethered to reality, while everyone else pulled me deeper into illusion. The Hale mansion itself seemed to amplify the dynamic. The long dining table, polished to a mirror shine, always seemed to magnify Dorian's presence, while shrinking mine. Evangeline would lift her glass to toast her brother's latest achievement. Helena would lean in to add her approving nod, and the rest of the family would join in the chorus. I, Selene, often found myself pressed against the edges of the conversation, shrinking into the background, my words dissolving before they ever reached the air. It was as though I was present in body, but absent in voice. Those gatherings were more than dinners. They were performances. Dorian played the leading man, adored and celebrated. Evangeline was the unwavering defender, reminding everyone why her brother was untouchable. Helena was the chorus of gossip, ensuring the narrative spread beyond the walls. Marcus, quiet and steadfast, was the lone voice that reminded me I wasn't invisible, even when I felt erased. The tragedy of it all was not just in how others treated me, but in how I began to accept that role. I told myself it was easier to let Dorian shine, to allow Evangeline her pride, to endure Helena's whispers, and to overlook Marcus's concerns. I thought sacrificing my place in the story was a form of peacekeeping, of keeping the family harmony intact. But what I didn't understand was that every time I shrank back, I gave more room for the lies to grow. The gossip Helena carried, the doubts Evangeline sowed, the applause that fueled Dorian, it all thrived because I had chosen silence. And that silence became the soil where betrayal took root. These relationships, these roles, they weren't just background noise, they shaped the world that allowed Dorian's deception to flourish. Each person, in their own way, played a part in the unraveling of my life, long before I even realized the curtain had begun to fall. At dinners, Dorian would chuckle, leaning back in his chair as though the world itself bowed to his confidence. He'd tilt his glass toward me and say, almost like a joke, "Selene doesn't understand how success works." And then came the laughter. Evangeline's sharp laugh, Helena's eager giggle, the ripple of amusement from the others around the table. It washed over me like a wave, drowning out any chance I had to speak for myself. My accomplishments, quiet, steady, real. were brushed aside as though they didn't exist. A project I finished at work, the long hours I spent paying our bills, even the sacrifices I made so Dorian could keep up his golden boy facade, all of it vanished in that moment, erased by the weight of their adoration for him. Evangeline was always quick to swoop in after these jabs, reinforcing the image of her brother as flawless. If Dorian so much as showed up at a meeting on time or made a decent meal, she praised him like he had climbed Everest. Her words made it clear where the spotlight should stay, fixed firmly on him. And while her praise filled the room, I felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller, as though my very presence was an afterthought. The message was constant and unmistakable. Dorian was the achiever, the hero, the one worth celebrating. I was the shadow standing behind him. Marcus, bless him, never let these moments slide without trying. He would speak up, calmly reminding the table that I worked harder than anyone knew, that I carried more than my fair share. But his voice was too soft against their chorus. Laughter drowned him out, rolled over his loyalty like it was nothing. And even I, sitting there with a knot in my stomach, would sometimes cut him off, forcing a smile, pretending it didn't matter. Because fighting back in that room didn't just feel impossible, it felt dangerous. Every challenge to Dorian's narrative was twisted into proof that I was bitter, fragile, or jealous. The pattern repeated itself endlessly. At birthdays, Dorian would retell stories about me, exaggerated and twisted into caricatures that made me the punchline. At neighborhood gatherings, he dropped subtle remarks that undermined my intelligence or made light of my sacrifices, and the crowd lapped it up. At holidays, when family is supposed to be a source of warmth, I became the easy target, the butt of the joke, the one whose silence made everything flow more smoothly. And every time I swallowed my hurt, every time I smiled through it, I confirmed their belief that this was acceptable. It's strange how repetition can condition you. You start to expect the humiliation, to brace yourself for it, and in some ways, even to normalize it. I convinced myself that if I just stayed quiet, if I just let Dorian shine, maybe the spotlight would move on, and the jabs would stop. But silence doesn't end mistreatment, it fuels it. Every ignored insult gave him more permission. Every laugh I let pass unchallenged gave them more reason to believe his narrative. This is what I want people to understand. Mistreatment often doesn't come as one grand betrayal. It's the accumulation of tiny cuts, day after day, year after year, until you're bleeding without even realizing it. It's the quiet dismissal of your worth, the subtle undermining of your voice, the way a room full of people can decide that one person's charisma outweighs your truth. And when you endure it long enough, it changes you. It makes you question your own reality, doubt your own accomplishments, and wonder if perhaps you really are as small as they make you feel. But here's the deeper lesson. Patterns don't change on their own. If you see yourself in my story, if you've been silenced at tables where you should have been celebrated, know this. Your worth is not measured by their laughter, and your silence is not the same as weakness. It's a survival tactic, yes, but it doesn't define you. What defines you is the moment you recognize the pattern and decide you deserve more than being the punchline. And for me, that moment was coming sooner than Dorian, or anyone else at those tables, could have ever imagined. The breaking point came on an ordinary evening, the kind of night that should have ended in quiet routine. Dinner was over, the dishes stacked in the sink, and I was heading down the hall to our bedroom when I passed by Dorian's study. The door was half open, and I heard his voice, low at first, then breaking into laughter. Evangeline's laugh followed, sharp and cutting, like glass against stone. I paused, something in me sensing danger, and in that moment I became an unwilling eavesdropper on a conversation that would change everything. Dorian's words sliced through me before I even had time to prepare. Selene is nothing without me. Even her own children see her weakness. The smugness in his tone was unmistakable, the kind of confidence that comes from repeating a lie so often you believe it's true. My blood turned to ice. My hands shook as I gripped the doorframe, torn between barging in and collapsing right there in the hallway. It was one thing to endure his dismissive jokes in public, the subtle digs at dinners, the laughter of family and neighbors at my expense. But to hear him, in the privacy of his study, confiding to his sister that I was worthless, even in the eyes of my children, was a betrayal that pierced deeper than all the rest. In that instant, everything I had carried for years came crashing down. The sacrifices, the late nights at work, the missed dreams, the way I bet myself into silence just to keep the peace, it all felt like ash in my mouth. He hadn't just belittled me. He had rewritten my role in our family, planting poison in the minds of the very people I loved most. The idea that my children might grow up believing his version of me, seeing me as weak and dependent, was unbearable. That was the line I could not ignore, the moment where survival demanded a response. I didn't burst into the room that night. Instead, I walked silently past the study, my heart hammering so loud it felt like it would wake the whole house. But inside me, something shifted irrevocably. The Selene who tolerated, who smiled through humiliation, who convinced herself that silence was strength, she began to die that night. And in her place, another Selene stirred, one who understood that staying quiet was no longer protection but complicity. Looking back, I see how necessary that breaking point was. Sometimes we don't move until we've been pushed so far we no longer recognize ourselves. For years, I had told myself to endure for the sake of love, for the sake of family, for the sake of keeping appearances. But betrayal has a way of stripping illusions bare. Hearing Dorian's voice in that moment was like being shown the raw truth without a mask. He never saw me as a partner, only as a prop to make himself look taller. Here's what I want anyone listening to take away. Sometimes the trigger that wakes us up is devastating. It hurts in a way words can hardly describe. But that pain also has power. It can ignite a fire you thought you had lost, reminding you that your worth is not determined by the lies others spread. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I didn't know exactly what I would do next. But I knew this. I would no longer let his voice define me. I would no longer allow his narrative to shape how my children saw their mother. That was the night everything shifted. It was not the end of the story, but it was the beginning of a different Selene, one who would no longer shrink into the background, one who would no longer laugh along to survive, one who finally realized that love without respect is just captivity in disguise. And from that moment on, every choice I made moved me closer to freedom, no matter how much it cost. I whispered to myself, "Selene, you've been silent too long. Today, silence ends." The words barely escaped my lips, but they reverberated through me like thunder. For years, I had let my voice shrink into the corners of every room. I had told myself that silence was noble, that enduring was strength, that love required sacrifice. But that night, after hearing Dorian mock me to his sister, something inside me refused to go back to sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, and repeated those words like a vow. Silence had been my shield, but now it had become my prison, and I was ready to break free. The days that followed were a blur of clarity and fear colliding. Every glance from Dorian felt different now. Every laugh he shared at my expense cut deeper. Every whisper from Helena or smug nod from Evangeline echoed louder. But instead of shrinking, I began to take note. I started to observe his patterns with new eyes. I saw how he manipulated conversations to make me small, how he planted seeds of doubt in others, how he relied on my silence to maintain his power. And for the first time, I understood the truth. Silence had been the currency he thrived on. Without it, his image would collapse. I began to reclaim small pieces of myself. At dinner one evening, when Dorian made one of his usual remarks about my supposed lack of ambition, I didn't laugh it off or bow my head. I looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Ambition doesn't look the same for everyone. Some of us measure success in what we build quietly, not in how loudly we boast." The room froze. Evangeline's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Helena blinked, surprised at the interruption of their usual script. For once, the laughter didn't come. And though Dorian brushed it off with a scoff, I saw it, the flicker of unease in his eyes. That was the moment I knew. My silence had been a stage, and by ending it, I had begun to dismantle the show. But breaking silence is not just about speaking. It's about choosing yourself in ways both big and small. I started reaching out to Marcus, not just as the childhood friend who defended me, but as someone I could finally listen to. His words, steady and unwavering, became a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that my sacrifices and pain were real. I began journaling, writing down everything I had endured, every comment, every humiliation. On paper, I saw patterns that had once blurred together. And with each word I wrote, I felt stronger, less invisible, more alive. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself. Not the Selene Dorian had convinced the world I was, but the Selene I had almost forgotten. I saw a woman who had worked tirelessly, who had raised children with love, who had kept a household afloat, who had endured storms without losing her heart. And I said it again, louder this time. Today, silence ends. Tears streamed down my face, not of sadness, but of release. For the first time in decades, I wasn't mourning who I was meeting her again. This is what I want to share with anyone listening. Silence can feel like safety, but it's also the soil where mistreatment grows. The longer you stay quiet, the stronger the lie becomes. Breaking that silence doesn't mean you'll have all the answers, or that the people around you will suddenly change. It means you've chosen to stand with yourself, even if no one else does. And that is the first step toward freedom. That vow I whispered to myself became the turning point of my life. From that night forward, I was no longer the passive character in Dorian's story. I was the author of my own. And while the world didn't shift overnight, I had shifted, and that was enough to change everything. My silence had ended, and with its end came the beginning of a new chapter. One written not in whispers, but in truth, strength, and unshakable resolve. I gathered proof, screenshots, letters, recordings. The fragments of truth that had been scattered over years of deception began to take shape in my hands. Every late-night message he sent to smear me behind my back, every smug letter he wrote that contradicted the lies he told in public, every recording where his voice betrayed the mask he wore so well, I collected them all. For years, I had allowed his narrative to dominate, but this time, the evidence spoke louder than his charm ever could. It wasn't easy. My hands trembled as I scrolled through old emails, my heart racing every time I replayed his voice on those recordings. Sometimes, I had to stop, step away, and breathe through the weight of it all. Proof doesn't just expose the liar, it forces you to relive every wound. But Marcus was there. Quiet, steady Marcus, who had watched me shrink in silence for years, became my anchor. He helped me organize the evidence, connect the threads, and when doubt clouded my resolve, he reminded me, Selene, this is your story. Don't let him own it any longer. Piece by piece, the web of manipulation became undeniable. The man who had told the world I was weak, who had convinced even his own sister that I was nothing without him, was revealed in his own words, in his own actions. And for the first time, I felt the balance of power shift. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was taking control. Then came the moment of decision. All the evidence in the world means nothing if it stays locked away. I remember sitting at my desk, the glow of the screen illuminating my face, my finger hovering over the button. Fear surged through me. Fear of retaliation, fear of being disbelieved, fear of what exposing him would do to my children. But underneath that fear burned something stronger. Resolve. I whispered, just as I had on that night of awakening, silence ends here. And then I pressed publish. My truth, Selene Hale's truth, was no longer locked in silence. It poured into the world unfiltered, undeniable. The letters, the screenshots, the recordings, they became the voice I had been denied for years. And once it was out there, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades, freedom. Not because the fight was over, but because I had finally stopped fighting myself. The world reacted swiftly. Those who had laughed at his jokes and praised his every move suddenly saw the cracks in his mask. Helena, who had carried gossip like fire, now found herself with nothing to spin, because the proof didn't need whispers, it shouted on its own. Evangeline, ever his defender, struggled to explain away the very words that came from her brother's mouth. And Dorian, the man who had built his golden boy image on my silence, watched as it shattered under the weight of my voice. Here's what I want you to understand. Bold action isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite the fear. I was terrified when I pressed that button, but courage doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means choosing truth anyway. It means valuing your own voice more than the comfort of keeping peace. And for anyone listening who feels trapped in someone else's narrative, know this. Your story is power. Don't underestimate it. The evidence you hold, the memories, the receipts, the moments you've written off as too small to matter, they are the puzzle pieces that, when placed together, reveal the full picture. And when that picture is finally revealed, no amount of charm, no polished mask, no chorus of defenders can erase it. That night, when I chose bold action, I didn't just expose Dorian Hale. I reclaimed Selene Hale. I showed my children and myself that silence may have stolen years from me, but truth would give me back my life. And once the truth is free, it cannot be caged again. The reaction was immediate, like a storm ripping through everything Dorian had built. The man who once commanded rooms with his easy laugh and polished charm now faced silence, where there used to be applause. Helena, the neighbor who had been so eager to feed on gossip, suddenly found herself without an audience. She stopped coming by, her once loud approval replaced with avoidance. For years she had thrived on repeating his stories, passing along whispers like trophies, but now the truth was too loud to be reshaped. Even she couldn't twist it into something manageable. She averted her eyes when we crossed paths, as though my truth had stolen the breath from her. Evangeline, though, was the most striking shift. She had always been Dorian's fiercest defender, his shield in family gatherings, the sister who could turn any criticism into an excuse. But now she was cornered by the very evidence she couldn't deny. The recordings, the letters, the screenshots. His own words left her with no room to argue. For the first time, I saw hesitation in her eyes, cracks in the unwavering loyalty she wore like armor. She didn't apologize, not immediately, but she no longer could hold her head high and dismiss me as the weak outsider. Confronting the lies she had so faithfully defended forced her to reckon with her own complicity. Then came the calls. My phone lit up constantly in the days that followed. Family members who had once laughed at Dorian's jokes rang me in shock, some of them even in tears. They confessed their guilt for not seeing through him sooner, for allowing his stories to shape their view of me. Friends admitted they had believed him, that they had doubted me, that they had judged me unfairly because his version of Selene seemed so convincing. One after another, their voices carried disbelief, shame, and relief. Relief that the truth had finally emerged. And as the truth spread, so did the secrets. It turned out Dorian's lies weren't limited to me. Affairs I had never known about came to light. Names and places whispered by those who had seen too much but stayed silent because they assumed I already knew. Hidden debt surfaced, accounts drained to maintain the illusion of his success. Even colleagues stepped forward, revealing how he had stolen credit for ideas, twisted narratives to keep his reputation spotless. The golden boy was no hero at all. He was a man who had built his empire on manipulation, and now the scaffolding had crumbled for everyone to see. The fallout was messy, painful, but strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of silence. The burden shifted onto him, where it always belonged. And though the revelations hurt, though it stung to realize how deep the deception ran, they also freed me. Each secret that spilled reminded me that his betrayal was never a reflection of my worth. It was evidence of his own emptiness. Here's the truth I want anyone listening to carry. When lies unravel, they rarely fall apart neatly. They tear through families, friendships, communities, and leave everyone grasping at what is real. But in that chaos, there is clarity. For me, the clarity was simple. I had survived years of being diminished, yet when the mask fell, it wasn't me who crumbled. It was him. The world finally saw the man Dorian Hale really was, and for the first time, I felt something close to peace. Not because the scars disappeared, but because the silence that once defined me had been broken forever. Dorian's world unraveled, not in a single dramatic explosion, but in a steady, relentless collapse that left nothing untouched. The man who once carried himself like the center of every room suddenly found doors closing before he even reached them. At work, his reputation evaporated almost overnight. Colleagues who had once applauded him began to distance themselves, citing the evidence I had made public. Projects he claimed as his own were re-examined, and the credit he had stolen from others became glaringly obvious. Within weeks, the golden boy image he had cultivated for 2 decades was gone. No more promotions, no more speaking invitations, no more hushed admiration in boardrooms. He became a liability, and the very people who once cheered him now scrambled to disassociate from him. His social circle collapsed just as quickly. The cocktail parties, the golf outings, the endless stream of friends who had basked in his charm, they all vanished. He couldn't show his face in public without whispers trailing behind him. At restaurants, people turned their heads, murmuring. At community events, invitations stopped arriving. Even Helena, who had once been his unofficial cheerleader, now avoided eye contact entirely. The spotlight that once adored him had become a burning glare of judgment he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, my world, once so small and muted, began to expand. Marcus stood by me, not in the background anymore, but as a pillar of support. He didn't gloat, he didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, he reminded me daily of the strength it took to break the silence, to step out of the shadows. His loyalty, so often overlooked, now became the steady ground beneath my feet. My children, the ones I feared most might believe his lies, surprised me in ways that still bring tears to my eyes. They held their heads high, not ashamed, not resentful. They told me they saw me, really saw me, for the strength I had shown. They admitted they had sensed things weren't right for years, but seeing me stand up, watching me refuse to let his lies define me, gave them a new kind of pride. They didn't see weakness anymore. They saw resilience, courage, and truth. And in their eyes, I finally saw the reflection of the woman I had always hoped to be. And then there were the strangers. Messages poured in from people I had never met, women who had endured their own betrayals, men who had been silenced in their own ways, even young people who said my story gave them courage to speak out. They wrote to say that my truth reminded them they weren't alone, that they, too, could reclaim their voices. Every message was a reminder that silence is isolating, but truth is contagious. My pain, once hidden, had become a torch for others. This is what karma looks like. Not lightning striking from the sky, but the slow, undeniable turning of tides. Dorian's lies, once his shield, became his chains. The success he flaunted, built on deception, crumbled because truth finally had a platform. And I, who had once been reduced to whispers and shadows, found myself lifted by voices around the world. Here's the lesson. Karma doesn't always come in the form of revenge or spectacle. Sometimes it comes quietly, steadily, in the erosion of falsehoods and the rise of truth. It reveals who stands with you when the dust settles and who disappears when the mask falls away. For me, karma wasn't just Dorian's downfall. It was my rebirth. His world unraveled, but mine began anew. And that contrast, the collapse of his empire against the rise of my voice, was proof enough that silence may protect lies for a season, but truth always outlives them. I moved on, not in a single sweeping gesture, but in quiet steps that slowly rebuilt the pieces of a life I thought had been permanently shattered. For so long, my name, Selene, had been tied to whispers of weakness, to Dorian's lies, to the shadow of his arrogance. But as the dust settled, I began to reclaim it. Selene no longer meant silence or shame. It became synonymous with strength, with truth, with the courage to stand even after being knocked down again and again. My children thrived without the constant weight of their father's dominance pressing down on them. Freed from his narrative, they began to flourish in ways I hadn't expected. They spoke more openly, laughed more freely, and carried themselves with a pride that mirrored the transformation happening in me. Watching them grow into confident individuals reminded me that breaking my silence wasn't just for me, it was for them. I had shown them that strength doesn't mean never falling. It means standing tall after the fall, refusing to let someone else's story define your future. Piece by piece, I built a new foundation. I pursued dreams I had set aside, finished courses I had once abandoned, and surrounded myself with people who saw my worth without needing me to prove it. Healing wasn't quick, and it wasn't always pretty. There were days when grief hit like a tidal wave, when the memories of betrayal pulled me under. But transformation happens in those moments too, when you choose to rise again, to take one more step, to believe that your story isn't over. I learned that healing isn't just survival. Survival is breathing, existing, moving through the day. Healing is transformation. It's the process of turning wounds into wisdom, scars into symbols of resilience. It's when the pain that once threatened to break you becomes the very fuel that empowers you. And so, my life became more than a response to betrayal. It became a testimony. I wasn't just the woman who endured Dorian Hale's lies. I was the woman who transformed them into light, who turned silence into a voice, who walked out of the shadows carrying not shame, but strength. And in that transformation, I finally found freedom. Months later, Dorian came crawling back, not with the confident stride that once captivated rooms, but with a posture bent low, his eyes dulled by the weight of his own undoing. The man who once laughed at my expense, who thrived on the sound of others belittling me, now stood before me stripped of the armor of lies he had worn for decades. His voice, once commanding, trembled with desperation. He wanted another chance, a path back into the life he had broken beyond repair. It was Evangeline who had pushed him to come. I could see it in the way she hovered, her hands clenched tight, her jaw set. For years she had been his loudest defender, the shield protecting his image at all costs. Now, with that image in ruins, she hoped I would be the one to rescue what little dignity remained of their family's name. Her eyes pleaded with me in a way her words never had before. This wasn't about love or reconciliation. It was about control, about appearances, about salvaging pride from the wreckage. But I was no longer the Selene who shrank into silence. I had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and fire. I had faced the destruction of my reputation and rebuilt myself into something stronger. So when Dorian dropped to his knees, his voice cracking as he begged for forgiveness, I felt no pull to soften, no instinct to rescue him from the consequences of his choices. I looked him in the eye, clear, steady, unflinching, and said, "Respect was all I ever asked for. Without it, you'll never have a place in my world again." The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Their weight came from truth, from years of silence finally breaking into power. His face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw not the man who had manipulated and mocked me, but the hollow shell left behind by his own arrogance. This moment was not about vengeance. It was about closure. It was about showing my children and myself that boundaries matter, that forgiveness is a gift, not an obligation, and that reconciliation is impossible without respect. Too often, families push for women to return, to endure, to keep the peace. But peace built on disrespect is nothing more than captivity. In that reckoning, I didn't just deny Dorian entry back into my life. I affirmed my own worth. I reminded Evangeline that loyalty to lies has consequences, and I showed my children that standing firm in dignity is sometimes the most loving act you can offer a family. Because true family, the kind worth holding on to, is not defined by blood or obligation, but by respect, truth, and love that doesn't demand your silence. Today, I look back at Selene Hale of the past, the silent one, and I barely recognize her. The woman who once sat quietly at dinners while her accomplishments were mocked, the woman who thought silence was loyalty, who believed love meant shrinking into the background. She feels like a stranger to me now. That version of Selene lived in the shadows of someone else's story, carrying the weight of his lies as though they were her burden to bear. But the Selene who stands here today, she has no interest in shadows. My truth went viral, but it gave me more than vindication. It gave me back myself. It gave me freedom, respect, and a voice no one will ever bury again. Vindication was sweet, yes. To see the world finally recognize the man Dorian really was, to have the lies exposed for what they were, to feel the burden of silence lifted from my shoulders, that mattered. But it was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, about rewriting the story I had once allowed someone else to narrate for me. And what I gained was far greater than watching his empire collapse. What I gained was the knowledge that my voice is power, that my story has value, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always rise. Sometimes the deepest betrayal becomes the sharpest tool of justice. Betrayal breaks you open, strips you bare, and forces you to confront who you are when everything else is gone. For me, betrayal became the crucible where silence was burned away, leaving behind the unshakable strength I carry now. Lies may echo for years. They may twist the way people see you, distort your name, and attempt to cage you in shame. But truth rings louder in the end. Truth doesn't need embellishment or defense. It simply waits for its moment, and when that moment comes, it shakes the ground beneath every lie that tried to bury it. So when I look back, I don't see a story of destruction. I see a story of transformation. I see a woman who was once silenced, but is now unshakably free. I see children who hold their heads high, proud of the mother who refused to let deceit win. I see a community reminded that charisma is no substitute for character, and that silence is not the same as consent. And to you listening now, I want you to take this with you. If you've been silenced, if someone has tried to write your story without your permission, know this. Your truth is still yours. It cannot be erased, no matter how long lies try to hold it down. The day you choose to speak, the day you refuse to shrink, is the day you begin to live free. If Selene Hale could find her voice after decades of silence, so can you. And as you carry that truth forward, remember this channel exists to keep these stories alive. Because every voice matters, and every truth deserves to be heard. So, if this story stirred something in you, don't just watch, act. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder that lies never win, and subscribe to Epic Karma Tale. Because together, we make sure the truth never stays buried.